There is a photograph that exists somewhere in the archives of the Pasadena Playhouse, a graduating class of young actors, full of ambition, full of the particular hunger that drives people to leave everything behind for a stage. Gene Hackman is somewhere in that photograph, and next to his name, or perhaps spoken aloud at a ceremony he likely tried to forget, was a distinction no one would have predicted would follow him for the rest of his life: most likely to fail. Not most likely to struggle, most likely to fail. 2 Academy Awards later, one for chasing a heroin dealer through the streets of New York, one for playing the cruelest sheriff in the history of the American West, he had long since stopped needing anyone's approval. By 2004, he walked away from all of it. No farewell tour, no final performance, just Santa Fe, New Mexico, a painting studio, and 50 years of silence he had apparently earned. And then, in February of 2025, in a house that had gone quiet in a different way, Gene Hackman was found dead. His wife, Betsy, had been gone for 7 days before anyone reached them. He had been there the entire time. He simply hadn't known. Have you ever achieved something that cost you everything and then watched the world move on as if the cost was never real? Leave a comment below, because that question is what this story is actually about. Gene Hackman was born on January 30, 1930 in San Bernardino, California, a dry, sun-flattened city pressed against the edge of the Mojave Desert, the kind of place that produced people who understood, early and without sentiment, that the world was not arranged in their favor. His family relocated to Danville, Illinois, a small manufacturing town of roughly 15,000 people, flat and unremarkable, where the winters were long and the expectations were practical and nobody with ambition tended to stay. His father, Eugene Ezra Hackman, worked as a pressman at a local newspaper. He was also a man who drank, who disappeared for stretches, and who had a quality that in some ways is harder to survive than outright cruelty. He was indifferent, not violent, not monstrous, simply a man who had arranged his life in a way that did not require him to be present for the people who needed him to be. Gene was 13 years old when his father got into a car and drove away from Danville. He did not return. The boy, who would later spend 5 decades playing men of iron conviction, learned the most formative lesson of his life from a man who demonstrated, clearly and irrevocably, that some people simply do not stay. His mother, Lydia, raised him through what remained of his adolescence, but the damage of that departure had done something to the household that staying alone could not repair. There was a distance between them that neither seemed able to close. When he was 16, he lied about his age and enlisted in the United States Marine Corps. It was 1946. The war was over. He was not enlisting out of patriotism. He was leaving a house where the silence had become its own kind of unbearable. He served 5 years. He came out in 1951 with a discipline he hadn't had before, and an ambition that had not yet found its direction. He drifted. Delivery driver, shoe salesman, doorman in New York City, standing at the entrance of other people's lives. These were not the years of a man finding himself. These were the years of a man who had not yet understood what he was for. By the late 1950s, something clarified. He enrolled at the Pasadena Playhouse and threw himself into it with the ferocity of a man who had no other plan. He was already in his late 20s, older than nearly all of his classmates, rougher around the edges, without the formal training or easy confidence that some of the younger students carried. At the end of his time there, the faculty arrived at a judgment delivered with the quiet authority of professional opinion. Gene Hackman was among the students most likely to fail as an actor. He carried that verdict with him for the rest of his life, not only as a wound, as something to answer. What was the moment someone told you that you weren't capable of something, and what did you do with it? Leave that in the comments, because the answer to that question tells you almost everything about who a person eventually becomes. In 1962, his mother died in a house fire. They had never reconciled. The distance that had opened between them the morning his father's car disappeared down the street had never closed. Whatever conversation might someday have bridged those years ended without resolution. Perhaps the most ordinary tragedy in the world, and also one of the most permanent. He was 32 years old, with no career and no family left to return to. He had New York City and almost nothing else, except 2 other men who were just as broke and just as certain that something was about to happen: Dustin Hoffman and Robert Duvall. The apartment they shared in the early 1960s was not romantic in any retrospective sense. It was small and cold, and occupied by three people who could not afford to be anywhere else. Three names that would eventually define American cinema, and in 1961, they were just three men eating whatever was cheap and waiting for the phone to ring. The phone rang slowly. Hackman ground through the early years the way only people with no alternative can. Small stage parts, occasional television work, constant rejection. He was not young by the industry's standards. He was not conventionally handsome. He did not fit the mold the studios had spent decades manufacturing. What he had was something more difficult to dismiss. When you watched him, the performance disappeared. You were simply watching a person. His first real foothold came in 1967 with Arthur Penn's Bonnie and Clyde, one of those films that changes what films are allowed to be. Hackman played Buck Barrow, Clyde's brother, reckless, warm, loyal, in the way of men who know the odds are against them and don't adjust their behavior accordingly. His first Oscar nomination for Best Supporting Actor. He did not win, but he had been seen in a way that could not be unseen. In 1971, William Friedkin cast him as Jimmy Popeye Doyle in The French Connection, a narcotics detective who was not heroic in any recognizable Hollywood sense. Relentless, abrasive, not entirely honest, and committed to a pursuit the film never fully justified in moral terms. Hackman played him without apology. The car chase through the elevated tracks of Brooklyn is one of the most technically accomplished sequences in American cinema. But what made the film was Hackman's face at the end of it, when the man he has spent the entire film hunting disappears through a door that closes before he can reach it. He won the Academy Award for Best Actor. He was 41 years old. The Pasadena Playhouse had been wrong. What followed was not the work of a man resting on a verdict. The Conversation in 1974, Superman in 1978, film after film in which his presence functioned as a guarantee, not that the film would be great, but that it would be worth something. His first marriage to Faye Maltese lasted 30 years and produced 3 children, Christopher, Elizabeth Ann, and Leslie Ann, before ending in 1986. The reasons were private and stayed private. In 1992, Clint Eastwood cast him as Little Bill Daggett in Unforgiven, a small-town sheriff who had built an entire identity around the exercise of authority and called the result justice. Hackman played him with complete conviction and zero self-awareness, which is the only way the character works. He won his second Academy Award for Best Supporting Actor. He gave his speech. He went back to his seat. He continued working. Have you ever built something that looked from the outside exactly like what you wanted, and known from the inside that it was costing you something you couldn't name? Leave a comment, because that tension is at the center of everything that came next. But what was accumulating quietly in those years, in the background of the films and the awards and the professional respect, was not something that appeared on any screen. The erosion that begins long before anyone names it had already started. And by the time the people closest to him understood what was happening, Gene Hackman had already begun, in the most private possible way, to disappear. Gene Hackman made his last film in 2004. It was called Welcome to Mooseport, a minor comedy, the kind of picture that exists at the edges of a career rather than at its center. There was no announcement, no farewell, no final interview in which he explained what he was doing or why. He simply stopped. He was 74 years old, and he was done. He moved to Santa Fe, New Mexico with his second wife, Betsy Arakawa, a classical pianist he had married in 1991, more than a decade into his first marriage's aftermath. Santa Fe was not a celebrity retreat in the way that some cities become. It was high desert, adobe architecture, a particular quality of light in the afternoon that painters have been chasing for a century. Hackman began painting. He took it seriously, the way he had taken everything seriously, not as a hobby, not as a retirement activity, but as a discipline with its own demands. He also wrote novels, 3 of them co-authored with a historian named Daniel Lenihan, set in the American West of the 19th century. They were not literary events. They were the work of a man who needed to keep making things. The public largely left him alone, which appeared to be exactly what he wanted. He gave almost no interviews. He made no appearances at industry events. When his name surfaced in print, it was usually in the context of some anniversary retrospective, someone else's occasion, not his. The man who had spent 5 decades being watched had, with apparent deliberateness, made himself unwatchable. But there was something else happening in Santa Fe that was not deliberate and was not a choice. Alzheimer's disease does not announce itself. It arrives the way that most irreversible things arrive, gradually, then suddenly, in the particular sequence that only becomes legible in retrospect. The precise timeline of Gene Hackman's diagnosis has not been fully established in the public record. What is known is that by the final years of his life, the disease had progressed to a stage that those close to him described as advanced. The man who had inhabited other people's minds for 5 decades, who had made a career of absolute psychological precision, was losing access to his own, Alzheimer's. Alzheimer's at its most advanced stages does not simply impair memory. It dismantles the architecture of awareness itself, the ability to track time, the ability to understand cause and effect, the ability to register that something has changed in the room, in the house, in the world immediately around you. It takes from a person not just the past but the present, the continuous updating awareness of now that most of us move through without noticing we possess it. Betsy Arakawa had been his primary caretaker through those years. She had remained in Santa Fe with him, managing the household, managing his care, doing the invisible and largely unwitnessed work that falls to the people who love someone through a long cognitive decline. She was not a public figure. She had not sought the attention that her husband had spent 30 years trying to deflect. She was simply present in the way that the best caregivers are present, continuously, without fanfare, at significant personal cost. Tooscout. Have you ever watched someone you love disappear in stages, not all at once but piece by piece, until the person who remains is a shape you recognize but can no longer fully reach? Leave a comment, because what happened next in that house in Santa Fe is something that only makes sense if you understand what that particular kind of loss actually costs. In February of 2025, a property caretaker arrived at the Hackman residence in Santa Fe. What they found inside has since been established through official investigation and reporting, and it is important to state it plainly, without decoration. Betsy Arakawa Hackman was dead. She had died from hantavirus pulmonary syndrome, a rare but serious illness caused by exposure to infected rodents contracted in the high desert environment of northern New Mexico. The medical examiner's findings indicated she had been dead for approximately 7 days before she was discovered. Gene Hackman was also found dead in the home. He was 95 years old. The cause of his death involved cardiovascular disease, complicated by his advanced Alzheimer's. He had been alive in some form in the days after Betsy died, and then he was not. What it established is this: Gene Hackman, in the final stage of his Alzheimer's progression, had not been able to process what had happened to his wife. Whether he understood at any point in those 7 days that she was gone, whether the disease had already taken from him the capacity to register her absence, is something that cannot be established with certainty. What can be established is that he did not call for help. He did not alert anyone. He remained in the house, in whatever remained of his awareness, until he too was gone. Has 3 children from his first marriage, Christopher, Elizabeth Ann, and Leslie Ann, released a statement expressing their grief. The industry he had spent 5 decades working in paused briefly to note his passing. The films remained what they had always been. What remains of Gene Hackman is not primarily the obituaries, which were respectful and accurate and conveyed the facts of a significant career. What remains is something harder to categorize. Carter. He had built, over the course of 95 years, a life of deliberate privacy, a life in which the work was public, and the man was not. He had survived his father's abandonment, his mother's death without reconciliation, the dissolution of a 30-year marriage, and the slow erosion of the mind that had been the instrument of everything he had made. He had done all of this without public comment. He had not written a memoir. He had not granted the interviews that might have offered context or explanation, or the particular kind of closure that public figures sometimes provide to the people who have spent decades watching them. What do you do when the tools that carried you your entire life are no longer available to you? When the discipline, the precision, the capacity for absolute attention that defined everything you built, when those things are simply gone, not because you failed to maintain them, but because the body that housed them has reached the end of its ability to hold? Think about that, and tell us in the comments what you believe the answer is. His Santa Fe studio, by accounts of those who knew the household, had the quality of a place that expected its occupant to return. The paintings were there, the materials were organized, the work of a man who had, in retirement, found another form of the same discipline he had practiced for 5 decades. the practice of paying close attention to something and rendering it honestly. Whether that work continues to exist and in what form is not yet part of the public record, but it was there. It was real, and it was made by a man who, long after the world had stopped requiring anything of him, continued to require things of himself. There is a version of Gene Hackman's story that is about failure and recovery, the abandoned boy who became a two-time Academy Award winner, the man the faculty dismissed, who proved everyone wrong. That version is true. It is also incomplete, because the more honest version of this story is not about triumph over adversity. It is about the cost of a particular kind of discipline, the cost of building your entire life around the capacity to pay attention, to be present, to render something real, and what happens when that capacity is taken from you, not by failure, but by time. Hoffman, he was a man who could not be reached easily, not by fame, not by praise, not by the industry that needed him. The people who managed to reach him were few, and they tended to be the ones who did not need anything from him. Betsy reached him, whatever the interior of that Santa Fe life looked like, and we will not know because he did not tell us. She was there, and she stayed, and she did the work that love requires when it stops being romantic and becomes something more demanding and more real. The last image of Gene Hackman is not from any film. It is from a house in the high desert of New Mexico in February of 2025, where a man and a woman who had been together for more than 30 years were found together. One had been gone for 7 days. The other had simply remained, not because he chose to, not because he understood, but because the part of him that would have known to leave had already gone somewhere he could not follow. If you felt something watching this story, take a moment to hit the like button. Not for the algorithm, but as a small acknowledgement that this man's life was worth your attention. Subscribe if you want to stay with stories told at this level of honesty. And leave a comment. What city are you watching from tonight? Or tell us, what is the Gene Hackman performance that stayed with you, and why? Share this with someone who remembers him. And finally, if you could say one thing directly to Gene Hackman right now, what would it be? Leave it below. He spent a lifetime not asking for that kind of attention, but he earned it.